The snow came down like shattered glass across the high country of Colorado. It was the kind of cold that made a man question every decision he had ever made in his life, the kind that crept beneath wool and leather and settled into bone like an old debt. December of 1873, and the Rocky Mountains did not care who lived or died upon their slopes. Three riders pushed through the storm on the narrow trail that wound down from the northern pastures toward the ranch house in the valley below. They rode single file, hunched against the wind, their horses blowing clouds of white vapor into the frozen air. 2 weeks they had been up on the high meadows, driving the last of the cattle down to winter shelter before the passes closed for good. 2 weeks of sleeping on frozen ground, eating jerky and hardtack, breaking ice off water troughs with rifle butts every morning before dawn. Gideon Dawson rode in front. He was the eldest of the three brothers, 33 years old, built like the mountains he had been born under. Broad across the shoulders, narrow at the waist, with arms that could wrestle a steer to the ground or split a cord of firewood before breakfast without breaking a sweat. His face was all hard angles and weather, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the peaks above cheekbones, sharp enough to cast shadows and eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight. Amber eyes. All three brothers had them. It was the one thing their mother had given equally to each of her sons. Gideon wore a red bandana knotted at his throat and a brown hat pulled low against the wind. He had not spoken in 3 hours. This was not unusual. Gideon Dawson could go entire days without saying more than a handful of words, and when he did speak, each word landed heavy as a stone dropped into still water. Behind him rode Silas, the middle brother, 31. Same face as Gideon, same amber eyes, same powerful frame, but everything about Silas was lighter, faster, more restless. Where Gideon was granite, Silas was a river in spring. His blue bandana was pulled up over his nose against the cold, his hat pushed back off his forehead, even in the driving snow, because Silas Dawson never wore anything the proper way if he could help it. He was the talker, the laugher, the one who could walk into a room of strangers and walk out with 5 new friends and a dinner invitation. But there was something behind the easy smile that only his brothers knew about, something that came out in the quiet hours when Silas thought no one was watching and the whiskey bottle was close at hand. Last came Emmett, the youngest at 29. Dark green bandana hat hanging by its cord down his back, hands steady on the reins despite the cold. Emmett was the quiet one. Not quiet like Gideon, who chose silence out of some deep and private weight. Emmett was quiet because he lived in his hands, not his mouth. He was a carpenter and a craftsman, a man who could look at a pile of raw timber and see a table, a chair, a house. His eyes moved constantly, reading the world in the way other men read books, cataloging details, measuring distances, noticing things his brothers missed. He had not spoken a word since they broke camp that morning, but he had retied the pack mule's load when the knot was slipping, adjusted Silas's saddle girth when the leather was stretching, and caught a loose horseshoe nail in the trail that would have lamed Gideon's stallion if it had been stepped on. 3 brothers, same face, same blood, same mountain, but 3 very different men. Gideon was the first to see it. He pulled his horse up short and raised his fist, the signal to stop. Silas reined in behind him, and Emmett a moment later. Through the curtain of falling snow, the ranch house was just visible below them in the valley. Smoke rose from the chimney. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Silas pulled down his bandana and said what they were all thinking. Nobody should be in that house. He was right. When the 3 brothers rode north to the high pastures 2 weeks ago, they had locked the cabin, banked the fire, and left. There was no hired hand, no neighbor with a key, no reason for smoke to be curling from their chimney on a December evening. Gideon drew the revolver from his belt. Beside him, Silas pulled the Winchester rifle from the scabbard on his saddle with the smooth speed of long practice. Behind them both, Emmett reached for the hand axe that hung at his hip. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The 3 brothers had been reading each other's movements since before they could walk. They approached the cabin from 3 directions. Gideon from the front, Silas circling left toward the stable, Emmett right toward the woodshed. The snow muffled their horses' hooves. The cabin windows glowed with firelight, warm and golden, as if the house were alive and breathing while its owners were away. Gideon dismounted 10 yards from the front door. He moved to the porch in a half-crouch, boots silent on the frozen planks, revolver up. He could hear something inside. Not voices, something quieter. The scrape of a pot on a stove. the small domestic sounds of someone making themselves at home. He kicked the door open. "Freeze!" The word exploded from his chest like a gunshot. A scream. High, sharp female. By the fireplace, a small figure stumbled backward, knocking a kettle from the hearth with a crash of metal on stone. She threw her hands up in front of her face, palms out, fingers trembling. "Please don't shoot. Please, I'm Wren Ashford. I came because of the letter, Mr. Dawson's letter." Gideon kept the revolver leveled. His eyes swept the cabin. One woman alone, young, small, barely more than a girl. She wore a white dress that might have been elegant once, but was now wrinkled and stained with road dust, the hem dark with mud and snowmelt. Her hair was the color of wheat in late summer, golden blonde, tumbled loose around her shoulders, as if she had been sleeping before his entrance tore her from whatever dream she had been having. Her eyes were blue, not the pale blue of winter sky, but deep blue, the blue of cornflowers, wide with terror and bright with unshed tears. Silas appeared at the side window, rifle aimed. Emmett materialized at the back door, axe in hand. Both saw the same thing Gideon did. A frightened girl alone, shaking by their fire. Gideon lowered the revolver slowly. "What letter?" The girl swallowed hard. She reached into the pocket of her dress with a trembling hand and pulled out a piece of paper, creased and soft from being read 100 times. She held it out to him like a white flag. Gideon took it. He did not need to read it. He recognized his own handwriting. The letter he had sent to the Boston Herald 4 months ago. The advertisement for a wife. Silas came through the side door, saw the letter in Gideon's hand, and his face changed. The easy grin disappeared. His eyes went dark. "You wrote a letter for a mail-order bride," he said slowly, "and you didn't tell us." "I was going to tell you when we got back." "You were going to tell us. That's your answer for everything. You decide, then you inform. Just like when you sold the South herd without asking. Just like when you signed in the timber contract without a word. You run this family like it's your army and we're your soldiers." "Silas," Gideon's voice carried the weight of a warning. "No, Gideon, not this time. You brought a woman into our home without asking. A stranger. She'll be living under our roof, eating at our table, and you didn't think maybe your brothers deserved a say in that." While the two older brothers faced each other, something else was happening that neither of them noticed. Emmett had set down his axe. He walked past both of them without a word, went to the fireplace, and added 2 split logs to the dying embers. Then he went to the kitchen, pumped water into the kettle, and set it on the stove to heat. He glanced once at the girl who stood pressed against the wall with her hands still raised, watching the brothers argue about her existence as if she were a piece of furniture they disagreed about purchasing. Emmett's eyes met hers for just a moment. He did not smile. He did not speak. But something in his gaze said what his mouth would not. "You're cold. You're scared. Those things will be taken care of." Then he turned back to the stove. Wren Ashford lowered her hands slowly. She had spent her entire life being discussed by strangers in rooms where she had no voice. The orphanage matrons deciding whether to keep her or send her away. The factory foreman debating whether a girl her size was worth the wages. The other seamstresses whispering about the girl with no family, no name, no people. She was practiced in the art of standing still while others decided her fate. But something was different now. The big quiet one with the green bandana had given her water without being asked. That small act in the midst of chaos was more kindness than she had received from most people in 22 years of living. Gideon settled the argument the way he settled everything, with finality. "She's here. Storm's coming. She can't go back down tonight." He turned to Wren, and his eyes were not warm, but they were not cruel either. They were the eyes of a man measuring weight on a scale. "You stay tonight. In the morning we talk." Wren nodded. She did not trust her voice. The next hour was stiff with silence. Gideon went out to stable the horses, staying longer than necessary because the cold was easier to bear than the tension inside. Silas sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle, not looking at anyone. Emmett moved quietly between the stove and the cupboard, making coffee, slicing bread, setting out jerky and dried apples on a tin plate that he placed on the edge of the table nearest to where Wren stood. She stared at the plate for a moment. Then she ate quickly, the way someone eats who has learned that food is not guaranteed and should be consumed before it can be taken away. Between bites, she told them what had happened. She had arrived in Silver Falls 6 days ago on the mail coach from Denver. No one met her. She asked at the general store for the Dawson ranch and was told it was half a day's ride up the mountain and that the three brothers were away on the North Range. Mrs. Crenshaw, the preacher's wife, took pity on her. The old woman gave her a mule, a wool blanket, a sack of biscuits, and directions up the trail. "You rode up here alone?" Silas asked, and despite his anger, there was something else in his voice now, something close to disbelief. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," Wren said simply. She had nearly died on the trail. She told them this without drama, the way you might mention that it rained last Tuesday. The mule lost its footing on the icy switchback above the creek crossing. She fell, landed in a snowbank, spent 20 minutes coaxing the animal back to the path, while the cold ate through her dress and her boots and her single pair of wool stockings. By the time she reached the ranch, she could not feel her feet. The cabin door was unlocked. She went inside, lit the fire with matches she found on the mantel, and waited. 6 days. She had been alone in this cabin for 6 days, keeping the fire going, rationing the biscuits. Mrs. Crenshaw had given her sleeping in a chair by the hearth because she did not dare presume to use one of the beds. 6 days of listening to the wind scream across the high country, wondering if the men who owned this house would ever return, wondering what they would do when they found her. Now she knew. One wanted to send her away. One had not spoken to her directly, and one had given her food. Gideon came back inside, stamping snow from his boots. He hung his coat by the door and his hat on the peg beside it. Without his hat, he looked different, younger somehow and more tired than a man of 33 should be. He sat down across from Wren at the table and poured himself coffee. "Upstairs," he said, not looking at her. "End of the hall. There's a room with a door that latches from inside." He paused. "It was our mother's sewing room. There's a bed in there now. You'll sleep there." Wren understood what he was saying and what he was not saying. The latching door was not a threat. It was a promise. "You are safe here. Lock yourself in if it makes you feel better. We will not cross that line." "Thank you," she said. Gideon nodded once, then went back to his coffee. That night, Wren lay in the narrow bed on the second floor beneath a quilt that smelled of cedar and dust and the faintest ghost of lavender. She could hear the brothers talking below her, their voices rising through the plank floor like heat through a grate. Silas still angry but quieter now. "She's tiny, Gideon. You really think she can handle a winter up here? She nearly froze just riding the trail." Emmett, rare and low like stones settling in a riverbed. "She's stronger than she looks. Watch her eyes." Gideon, heavy and final as a closing door. "Listen to me, both of you. She came here because of my letter. What happens next is my responsibility. Don't either of you do anything foolish." A long silence. Then Silas, softer. "You wrote that letter and you haven't said a single kind word to her since she got here. You know that, right?" No answer from Gideon. Wren pressed her face into the pillow and stared at the dark. She could feel the cabin around her, solid and creaking in the wind, built by hands that knew what they were doing. She could feel the mountain beneath the cabin, ancient and indifferent. And she could feel somewhere in the deep, cold center of her chest a tiny flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time. It might have been hope. She was not sure. She had so little experience with the feeling that she could not be certain. She slept. The storm arrived before dawn, not the storm that had been blowing for days, the steady gray veil of winter in the high country. This was something else. This was the kind of storm that old men in Silver Falls would talk about for years afterward, the kind that killed cattle standing up and buried fences under 6 feet of snow. The wind hit the cabin like a freight train, shaking the walls, rattling the windows in their frames. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the inside of the glass. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. And inside the cabin, 4 strangers began the slow and uncertain work of becoming something else. On the first morning of the storm, Wren woke before anyone. It was still dark, the wind shrieking outside, but she could see her breath in the cold air of the bedroom, and she knew the fire downstairs needed tending. She dressed quickly, crept down the stairs, and found the main room dark and frigid. The fire burned to embers during the night. She rebuilt it. Then she went to the kitchen. The state of the Dawson brothers' pantry told her everything she needed to know about how they had been living. Salt pork in a barrel, dried beans in a sack, coffee, flour that had gone slightly stale, sugar with a crust on top, a few withered potatoes in a bin, no spices, no preserves, No sign that anyone had cooked a proper meal in this kitchen in months, maybe years. Three men had been surviving here, not living. Eating to stay alive, not to be nourished. Wren rolled up her sleeves. She had learned to cook in the orphanage, not from the matrons who ran the place, but from Mrs. Pemberton, the old housekeeper who managed the kitchen. Mrs. Pemberton believed that food was dignity, that a well-made biscuit could remind a forgotten child that someone in the world cared whether they ate. She had taught Wren to make bread with almost nothing, to turn dried beans and salt pork into something that tasted like somebody loved you, to brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead and smooth enough to make them grateful for it. By the time the brothers stirred, the cabin smelled like a different place. Hot biscuits, golden and steaming. A pot of beans simmered with salt pork, and the last of the potatoes thick as stew. Coffee so rich it was almost black. Silas came down first, drawn by the smell, like a hound on a scent. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his long johns and wool socks, his hair standing in every direction, and he stared at the table as if he were seeing a vision. Good Lord. He looked at Wren, then at the food, then back at Wren. Is this real? Sit down and eat before it gets cold, she said. Silas sat. He took a biscuit, bit into it, and went completely still. For 3 full seconds, Silas Dawson, who had not been silent for 3 consecutive seconds in his adult life, said nothing at all. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, softer, younger. This is the best thing I've eaten since... He stopped. The sentence hung in the air unfinished, but the ending was there for anyone who knew where to look. Since Mama was alive. Gideon had come down the stairs behind Silas. He stood in the shadow of the staircase, and Wren saw his face change when Silas's words hit the air. Something tightened behind his eyes. He set down the fork he had just picked up, pushed back from the table, and walked out onto the porch into the screaming wind without a word. The door banged shut behind him. Silas looked down at his plate. Emmett, who had appeared silently at the table, glanced at the door, then at Wren. He shook his head once slightly. The meaning was clear. Not your fault. Give him time. Wren did not ask what had happened. She did not ask about the woman in the portrait over the fireplace, the one with the amber eyes and the gentle smile. She did not ask about the empty picture frame beside it, the one with the cracked glass. She cleared the table, washed the dishes, and began looking around the cabin for things that needed doing. There were many. On the second day, the storm grew teeth, wind gusts strong enough to knock a man off his feet, snow falling so thick you could not see the stable 30 paces from the cabin door. And then, in the dead of night, a sound like the world splitting open. A massive pine tree, weakened by ice, came crashing down on the corner of the stable roof. The horses screamed. The sound tore through the cabin like cannon fire, and all 3 brothers were on their feet and running before the echo died. What happened next was something Wren would remember for the rest of her life. She watched it from the cabin window, her face pressed against the cold glass, and it was like watching a single creature with 6 arms and 3 hearts. No one shouted orders. No one asked what to do. Gideon grabbed the lantern and a rope and went straight for the damaged section of roof. Silas was already inside the stable, his voice cutting through the horses' panic, calm and steady, leading them one by one out through the side door to the cattle shelter. Emmett climbed onto the collapsed section of roof with a saw clenched between his teeth and an axe in one hand, cutting away the fallen tree limb that was crushing the structure, working in the dark, in the wind, in the killing cold, with a precision that made it look almost easy. They communicated with hand signals. A pointed finger, a raised fist, and nod. 3 men who had worked together since childhood, who knew each other's movements the way a man knows his own heartbeat. It was, Wren realized, beautiful. Terrifying and freezing and dangerous, but beautiful. She did not stand at the window watching for long. She pulled on Gideon's spare coat, which hung to her knees, and went outside to the cattle pen to make sure the cows were not stampeding through the broken fence into the storm. They were frightened but contained. She checked each one by lantern light, speaking softly the way Mrs. Pemberton used to speak to the frightened children at St. Agnes. Calm sounds, steady sounds, the sounds that tell a scared creature that someone is in charge and everything is going to be all right. When the brothers came back inside, soaked through and shaking with cold, they found the cabin blazing with warmth. Wren had built the fire up as high as it would go. Hot water was ready in the basin. Clean rags were stacked on the table. Coffee was poured and steaming. She saw the blood on Emmett's hand first. a deep gash across the palm where a splinter of wood had torn through his work glove. He was holding it against his coat, trying to hide it, and she realized with a start that this enormous silent man was embarrassed to be injured in front of her. "Let me see," she said. He pulled his hand back. Not from pain, from the shock of being touched. Wren waited. She did not grab, did not insist. She simply held her own hands out, palms up, and waited. After a moment, Emmett placed his injured hand in hers. She cleaned the wound carefully, picked out the splinter with a needle she sterilized in candle flame, and wrapped the hand in a strip of clean cloth torn from a flour sack. Her fingers were small against his massive palm. She worked quickly, competently, without fuss. When she finished, Emmett looked at his bandaged hand, then at her with an expression she could not quite read. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of trust. She poured coffee for Silas, who took it with both shaking hands and a grin that was half gratitude and half something else. Then she poured a cup for Gideon. He took it. He looked up at her. And for the first time since she had arrived at this ranch, something in Gideon Dawson's amber eyes shifted. The wall was still there, high and thick, and built from years of loss. But there was a crack in it now, thin as a hair, and through it she could see just a sliver of something warm. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. From Gideon Dawson they weighed more than a sermon. On the evening of the second day, the storm settled into a steady roar, and the 4 of them gathered around the fireplace. This was when the stories came the way stories always do, when people are trapped together and the dark is pressing in. Silas told the stories. He was built for it, the way some men are built for preaching or fighting. He told Wren about growing up on this ranch, the 3 of them, wild as coyote pups, racing their horses across the summer meadows, swimming in the creek, until their mother called them home for supper. He told her about their father, Hank Dawson, who had homesteaded this land when it was nothing but trees and rock and possibility. A man who could build anything with his hands and believed in 2 things above all else: the land beneath his feet and the family around his table. He told her about their mother, a Virginia woman who followed her husband into the wilderness with seeds in her pockets and songs on her lips. She planted a flower garden beside the cabin, carrying the seeds 2,000 miles across the country in a cotton pouch tied to her belt. Wildflowers, mountain columbine, Indian, paintbrush, blue flax. She would kneel in the dirt in her good dress and dig with her bare hands, and when Hank asked her why she bothered planting flowers in a place where the winters could kill anything, she said words that Silas repeated now with the careful reverence of prayer. "A house without flowers is a house without a soul." She died of lung fever on a cold November night 6 years ago, when Emmett was 23. The flowers died with her. No one had planted the garden since. While Silas talked, Emmett sat by the fire carving a piece of pine, with his good hand, the bandaged one, resting on his knee. Wren watched his knife move. He was carving a flower. She recognized the shape. A columbine, the state flower of Colorado, his mother's flower. Gideon sat apart from the others, his back against the wall, reading a leather-bound journal by lamplight. The journal was old. The binding cracked, the pages filled with cramped handwriting. He turned the pages slowly, the way you turn pages when you are not reading, but remembering. Wren shared a little of herself. Not much, just enough. Orphan, St. Agnes Home for Children in Boston. No parents, no siblings, no family of any kind. She told them about Mrs. Pemberton, the only person who had ever been kind to her, who taught her to cook and to read and to sew, and who told her on the day Wren turned 18 and was put out of the orphanage with nothing but the clothes on her back, "You have nothing in this world but yourself. Make that be enough." She told them she had never had a Christmas with a family. She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way you state a fact about the weather or the time of day. It was simply a true thing about her life. Silas went quiet. This was so unusual that Emmett looked up from his carving. Silas's blue bandana was untied, hanging loose around his neck, and his eyes, those amber Dawson eyes, were bright with something he was trying not to show. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "Christmas is 9 days away, and you've got 3 of the loudest brothers in the Rocky Mountains to spend it with. I can't promise it'll be fancy, but I can promise it'll be noisy." Wren smiled. It was the first real smile since she had stepped off the mail coach in Silver Falls, and it changed her face completely. The fear faded. The wariness softened. For just a moment in the firelight, she looked like what she was. A young woman, bright and brave, who had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of a single letter and a prayer. Emmett looked up from his carving when she smiled. He stared at her for a moment, then dropped his eyes back to the wood. But the knife moved differently after that. Slower, more carefully. On the third day, the thing that had been growing in the silence finally broke through. Wren was cleaning the mantelpiece when her elbow caught the empty picture frame. It fell. She caught it before it hit the floor, but the impact jarred something loose. A folded piece of paper slipped from behind the backing and fluttered to the ground. She picked it up. She knew she should not read it. She knew it was not hers. But the paper had fallen open, and the words were right there in front of her, written in the same heavy hand as the journal Gideon read every night. Gideon, you are the eldest. If I don't come back, keep your brothers. Keep the land. Don't sell to Stone no matter what he offers. And find a good woman for this ranch. Not just for yourself, but for the whole family. This cabin needs a woman's heart, son. I owe your mother that much. Pa. The room went cold. Not from the storm. From Gideon, who stood in the doorway behind her, staring at the letter in her hand. Put it down. His voice was level, controlled, terrifying. Wren set the letter on the mantel, but she did not bow her head. She did not shrink. She had spent 22 years being told to be quiet, be small, be grateful, be invisible. She had crossed a continent alone. She had survived 6 days in an empty cabin on a frozen mountain. She was done being small. I'm sorry for reading your private letter, she said, looking directly into his eyes. But you brought me here. You wrote to me, you brought me up this mountain, and you haven't told me one true thing since I arrived. I deserve to know what I've walked into. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Silas broke it. He always broke silences. It was his gift and his curse, the inability to let painful quiet stand. The truth came in pieces, delivered in Silas's quick voice with pauses where the words cut too deep to say quickly. Their father, Hank Dawson, was shot dead on the trail between Silver Falls and the ranch 2 years ago. They found him face down in the snow, the blood frozen black around him. His wallet was still in his coat. His horse was standing beside him, reins trailing. His rifle was still in its scabbard. Nothing was taken. It was not robbery. It happened exactly 2 weeks after Hank refused to sell the northern section of the ranch to Jedodiah Stone, a silver mine owner from the town of Elkhorn on the other side of the mountain range. No one was ever caught. The county sheriff, whose salary was supplemented by monthly envelopes from Stone's mining company, ruled it a random act of trail violence. Case closed. Gideon was the one who found him. He had ridden out at first light to meet his father on the trail, worried because Hank had not returned the night before. He found the body 3 miles from the ranch, already stiff, already cold. He lifted his father onto his shoulders and carried him home through the snow 3 miles uphill alone. The empty picture frame on the mantel had held Hank's photograph. Gideon removed it the night of the funeral because he could not bear to look at his father's face. The cracked glass was from the night 3 months later, when the grief and the rage boiled over and Gideon put his fist through it. He left the frame there cracked and empty, the way some men leave wounds open to remind themselves of what was lost. Emmett added his piece. His voice was low and halting, each word dragged up from somewhere deep. That night, the night Pa died, I was here in the cabin. I heard the gunshot. He stopped. His jaw worked. I thought it was a hunter. Just a hunter. I went back to sleep. Another stop longer this time. If I'd gone out, if I'd run down the trail. He did not finish the sentence. He never finished the sentence. And then there was the reason Gideon had written the letter. The family was falling apart, Silas said, and this time his voice was not quick or bright. This time it was tired. After Pa died, everything just started to come apart. I started drinking. I know that. Don't look at me like that, Gideon, I know it. Emmett stopped talking, stopped eating with us some nights, just went out to his workshop and stayed there in the dark. And Gideon did what Gideon always does. He tried to hold everything together by himself, worked harder, slept less, talked less, built the walls higher. Gideon was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, face unreadable. But Wren was watching his hands. They were shaking, not from cold. Pa told me to keep the family, Gideon said, and his voice cracked on the word family like ice splitting on a frozen river. I'm failing. I don't know how to do this. I know how to chop wood and drive cattle and shoot straight. I don't know how to keep my brothers from disappearing right in front of me. The fire popped. Snow hissed against the windows. The storm howled on. Wren stood in the middle of the cabin 3 feet from the mantel, where a dead man's letter lay open, looking at 3 men who were each carrying a wound they did not know how to heal. Gideon, who had armored himself so heavily against loss that he could no longer feel anything else. Silas, who laughed to keep from drowning. Emmett, who built beautiful things with his hands because he could not build back the one thing he had failed to protect. She knew what she was looking at. She had seen it in the mirror at the orphanage every morning for 18 years. She was looking at people who had lost everything and were trying to survive on stubbornness alone. "I grew up without a father," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tight in front of her knuckles white. "Without a mother, without brothers or sisters or anyone at all. I don't know what family is. I've never had one." She paused, drew a breath. "But I know what it's like to lose something you never had the chance to hold. And I know what it looks like when people are trying to keep something precious alive and they're running out of strength to do it." She looked at each of them in turn. Gideon, who would not meet her eyes. Silas, who would not stop. Emmett, who watched her with that quiet, measuring gaze. "I'll stay," she said. "Not because of the letter, not because of any agreement, because I can see 3 men trying to hold on to the most important thing in the world. And I want to help. I want to try. I want to see if 4 strangers on a mountain can turn this place into something like a home." The fire crackled. The storm shook the walls. Silas smiled, a real smile, not the mask he wore. Emmett set down his carving knife and nodded once slowly, and the half-finished columbine on the table beside him looked like a promise not yet kept. Gideon looked at her for a long time. 10 seconds? 20. Long enough that the silence should have been unbearable, but it was not. It was the silence of something being weighed, measured, and found worthy. "All right," he said quietly. That night, after the others had gone to their beds, Wren stood at the window of her small room on the 2nd floor, looking out at the storm. The moon was trying to break through the clouds, and for one brief moment, it succeeded, painting the snow-covered valley in cold silver light. And in that moment on the mountainside across the valley, something flashed. Quick, sharp, like light glinting off glass, like someone watching through a telescope. Then the clouds closed over the moon and it was gone. Wren blinked, stared into the darkness. It was probably nothing. Moonlight on ice, a trick of the storm. But out in the snow, riding hard down the mountain trail toward the mining town of Elkhorn, a man named Virgil Crane spurred his horse through the drifts. He had a report to deliver. The Dawson boy had brought a bride to the mountain. Jedodiah Stone would want to know. The blizzard broke on the 4th morning. Wren woke to something she had not heard in days. Silence. True silence, the kind that only exists in the high mountains after a heavy snow, when the world is buried so deep that even the wind gives up and goes still. She went to the window. The valley below the ranch was transformed. Every tree, every fence post, every rock was draped in white, smooth and softened, until the landscape looked like something dreamed rather than real. The sky was the pale blue of a robin's egg, cloudless from horizon to horizon, and the sun hit the snow with a brightness that made her eyes water. Downstairs, the cabin was already empty. She could hear the brothers outside, their voices carrying in the crystal air. Gideon giving orders, Silas laughing at something. The rhythmic thud of Emmett's axe splitting firewood. The ordinary sounds of men returning to work after being caged for 3 days. Wren made breakfast. She had been making breakfast for 4 days now, and already it had become a thing that was expected without being demanded. That was how the cabin worked, she was learning. Nothing was asked for. Things simply appeared when they were needed, and if you were the one who provided them, the acknowledgement came not in words, but in the quiet absence of complaint. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Wren's life. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because something was growing in the spaces between the dramatic things. Something quiet and stubborn, like the seeds her mother-in-law had planted in the garden outside. Invisible beneath the snow, but alive, pushing slowly toward the light. Each day followed the same rhythm. She woke before dawn, built the fire, made coffee and breakfast. The brothers ate quickly and went out to the endless work of keeping a mountain ranch alive in winter. Checking cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, repairing fences that the snow had crushed, hauling hay from the surviving stores in the barn to the feeding stations scattered across the lower pastures. They returned at dusk, cold and spent, and Wren had supper waiting. Evenings around the fire. Then sleep. Then again. Within this rhythm, three separate relationships began to take shape, each as different from the others as the three brothers were from each other. With Silas, it was easy. Silas made everything easy. He was the one who broke through first as naturally as water finds a crack in stone. Within a week of the storm's end, he had appointed himself Wren's teacher in the ways of mountain living. He taught her to ride, starting with the oldest, gentlest mare in the stable, a sway-backed gray named Patience, who moved with all the urgency of a church deacon on a Sunday afternoon. The first lesson ended with Wren face down in a snowbank, while Patience stood over her with an expression of profound indifference. Silas laughed so hard he had to hold onto the fence to stay upright. The second lesson ended the same way, but from a different direction. The third time Wren started to slide, Silas was close enough to grab her arm and pull her back into the saddle, and they ended up clutching each other on the horse's back, both laughing until their ribs ached. He gave her a name, Boston, because she still flinched every time a coyote howled at night, and because the way she held a coffee cup with both hands wrapped around it like it was the last warm thing on earth was, according to Silas, the most Eastern thing he had ever witnessed. But Wren saw past the laughter. She was learning to see past all of them, the way you learn to read a landscape after you have lived in it long enough. The mountains looked solid from a distance, unchanging, but up close they were full of cracks and crevices and hidden caves where the wind sang different songs. One night in the second week, she woke to a sound she could not place, a soft, rhythmic creaking like a rocking chair on a porch. She went to the window and looked down. Silas was sitting on the front step in the moonlight, a bottle of whiskey between his boots, rocking slowly forward and back. He was not drinking. The bottle was open, but he was just sitting there staring at the mountains, and even from above and behind glass, Wren could see that the man on the porch was not the same man who laughed at breakfast. This man's shoulders were curved inward, and his hands hung between his knees, and he looked like someone who had been carrying a weight so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. She did not go down. She understood that some griefs need room, and she had learned at the orphanage that the worst thing you can do for a person in pain is to take their solitude away before they are ready to give it up. But in the morning, she made something different for breakfast. Porridge, thick sweet with brown sugar and a little cinnamon she had found in the back of the pantry. It was what Mrs. Pemberton used to make for the children at St. Agnes on the mornings after the bad nights. The nights when someone cried or someone left, or someone was told they were not wanted. Comfort food, the kind you make when words are not enough. Silas sat down, looked at the bowl, looked at Wren. The smile was gone. In its place was something raw and open and startled, like a man who has just been seen through a wall he thought was solid. "You know the worst thing about being identical," he said quietly. "Every time I look in a mirror, I see their faces. Ma, Pa, Gideon, and Emmett. I never see just me. I can never get away from them." Wren set down her own spoon. "Maybe you're not supposed to get away from them. Maybe you're supposed to make peace with them." Silas stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his spoon and ate the porridge without another word. But that evening, for the first time since Wren had arrived, the whiskey bottle stayed in the cupboard. With Emmett, the connection grew in silence. This was fitting because Emmett lived in silence the way fish live in water. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words were so sparse and carefully chosen that each one carried the weight of 10. But he spoke with his hands. 3 days after the storm, Wren came down to breakfast and found a small wooden shelf mounted on the wall beside her bed. She had mentioned nothing about needing one. She had simply been keeping her 2 books, the Bible, and a worn copy of Jane Eyre that Mrs. Pemberton had slipped into her bag the day she left the orphanage, on the floor beside her bed because there was nowhere else to put them. Emmett had noticed. Emmett noticed everything. And sometime during the night, moving with the silence of a man who spent his life working with tools, he had carried the shelf upstairs and mounted it with wooden pegs instead of nails, so the hammering would not wake her. She found other signs of him in the days that followed. The door to her room, which had squeaked on its hinges, suddenly swung smooth and silent. A hook appeared on the back of the door for her coat. A small wooden box, sanded smooth and fitted with a tiny brass latch, materialized on her shelf one morning. It was exactly the right size to hold her few possessions. The Bible, a spool of thread, the lace handkerchief embroidered with lavender flowers, the only gift anyone had ever given her. Emmett never mentioned these things, He never pointed to them or waited for thanks. Wren understood that this was how he communicated. Other men used words. Emmett used pine and oak in the steady rhythm of saw and chisel. She found her way into his world by accident. One afternoon, with the brothers out on the range and the cabin chores done, she took her sewing basket out to the small workshop attached to the stable where Emmett did his carpentry. She sat on a stool near the workbench and began mending a pair of Silas's trousers which had torn at the knee for the third time. She did not ask permission. She did not explain herself. She simply sat down and began to work. When Emmett returned that evening and found her there still sewing by the light of a lantern, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the workshop around her, his private space, the one place on the ranch that belonged to him alone. Then he walked to his workbench, picked up the piece of wood he had been shaping, and began to work. They sat together for 2 hours without exchanging a single word. The only sounds were the rasp of his plane on wood, the whisper of her needle through cloth, and the occasional gust of wind against the workshop walls. It was, Wren realized, the most comfortable silence she had ever shared with another human being. This became their routine. Every few evenings, when the light was fading and the brothers were settling into their nighttime habits, Wren would take her sewing to Emmett's workshop and sit with him while he carved. They rarely spoke. They did not need to. It was during one of these sessions that she saw the cradle. She had dropped a spool of thread and it rolled beneath the workbench into the corner. When she knelt to retrieve it, she saw something pushed against the wall, half hidden under a canvas tarp. She pulled the tarp back. A cradle. Small, exquisitely made, the wood sanded to silk. It was unfinished, the headboard only roughed in the rockers, not yet attached. But the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every joint was perfect. Every curve was smooth as water. Emmett came around the workbench and saw her looking. His face went red from his collar to his hairline. He reached for the tarp to cover it again, but Wren had already risen. She did not say a word about it. She simply picked up her sewing, sat back down on her stool, and began a new seam. After a moment, Emmett sat down too. His ears were still burning, but his hands were steady as he picked up his tools. The cradle was a prayer. Wren understood this. It was a prayer that Emmett had begun months before she arrived, a prayer that someday this house would hold more than grief, that a child would sleep in it, that the family would grow instead of shrinking, that something new would be born in a place where too much had died. She never mentioned the cradle to anyone. Some prayers are private. With Gideon, everything was harder. He kept his distance with the discipline of a soldier guarding a perimeter. He called her Miss Ashford long after his brothers had switched to Wren. He did not eat supper with them every night. Some evenings he disappeared into the stable after the work was done and did not return until the others were asleep. He was polite but never warm, courteous but never open, and he avoided being alone with her the way a man avoids standing on the edge of a cliff, not because he does not want to fall, but because he knows he might. Wren felt the sting of it. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she was here for the family, not for any one man, and that Gideon's distance was his own burden, not hers to carry. But the telling did not quite take, because there was something about Gideon Dawson that got under her skin and would not come out. The way he checked every dangerous section of trail before he let the others pass. The way he sat up alone by the fire reading his father's journal long after midnight, his face soft and unguarded in the lamplight, when he thought no one could see. The way he had looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup the morning after the stable roof collapsed, with those amber eyes that said things his mouth refused to speak. She understood gradually that Gideon was not cold. He was afraid. He had loved his mother, and she died. He had loved his father, and he died. He loved his brothers, and every day he watched one drown in whiskey and the other retreat deeper into silence, and he was powerless to stop either. Gideon Dawson had learned the hardest lesson a man can learn, that loving someone is an invitation for the world to take them away. The wall he had built was not to keep her out. It was to keep himself in. The night that changed everything was a Wednesday. She could not sleep. The cabin was quiet, the fire banked low, the brothers in their beds. She crept downstairs for water and heard a voice coming from the stable. Low, rough, unsteady. She went to the stable door and looked through the gap between the boards. Gideon sat on a hay bale, his father's journal open on his knee. The old stallion, the one Hank Dawson had ridden before he died, stood beside him with its graying muzzle resting on Gideon's shoulder. And Gideon was reading aloud. His voice was barely above a whisper cracked at the edges, the voice of a man talking to the only listener who would never leave him. He read his father's words about the price of timber that season, about a fence that needed mending in the south pasture, about a hawk he had seen circling the high ridge at sunset. Ordinary things, the small daily entries of a working man's life. But Gideon read them like scripture because they were all he had left. Wren stepped on a dry twig. The sound cracked through the stable like a pistol shot. Gideon looked up, and for one unguarded second she saw his face without the wall. She saw exhaustion and grief and loneliness so deep it had no bottom. Then the wall came back up, but slower than before, and not quite as high. "I talked to the horse," he said, "because the horse never leaves." Wren leaned against the doorframe. "I never had anyone to leave." They looked at each other across the dim stable, the old horse breathing between them. Something passed in that look, wordless and heavy and real. Not a promise. Not yet. But the acknowledgement that a promise might someday be possible. Gideon closed the journal. "Go back inside, Wren. It's cold." It was the first time he had called her by her name. 4 weeks after Wren's arrival, on a morning when the sky was the color of tin and the air tasted of iron, 5 riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch. Gideon saw them first. He was mending fence on the north boundary when the shapes materialized against the white sky, black figures on black horses moving in single file along the ridgeline. He dropped the fence wire and drew his rifle from the scabbard on his saddle in one fluid motion. The riders came down the slope at a walk, no hurry. No need for hurry when you have 5 men and 3 rifles, and the law means whatever you decide it means. In front rode Jedodiah Stone on a coal-black mare that probably cost more than the Dawson ranch earned in a year. Stone was 45 years old, medium height, medium build, with the kind of face that looked friendly in the way a fox looks friendly to a hen. Clean-shaven, well-dressed with a beaver skin coat and polished boots that had never seen a day of honest work. His smile was wide and white, and about as warm as the January snow. Beside him rode Virgil Crane. If Stone was the brain, Crane was the fist. A former cavalry soldier, tall and wiry, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulling his face into a permanent sneer. He wore 2 pistols on his belt and a Winchester across his saddle, and his eyes moved constantly, reading the terrain the way a predator reads a field. Behind them, 3 more riders. Hired guns, nondescript, interchangeable. Men who worked for money and did not ask questions about the nature of the work. Gideon rode down to meet them. Silas appeared from the stable. Emmett came around from the workshop, a hand axe hanging at his side. The 3 brothers formed a line in front of the cabin, without planning it, without speaking. They simply fell into formation the way they always did when the ranch was threatened. Stone dismounted with the ease of a man paying a social call. He removed his hat and smiled that fox smile. "Gideon Dawson, been a while." "Stone." Cold day for fence work. Stone looked around the ranch with the appraising eye of a man calculating property values. His gaze moved across the stable, the cattle pens, the outbuildings, and then stopped on the cabin porch where Wren had just stepped outside. His smile changed. It widened, but it did not warm. If anything, it got colder. "Well now, who do we have here?" He swept his hat from his head and performed an elaborate bow in Wren's direction. "The new bride, I presume. The whole valley's been talking. You are, if I may say so, far too lovely a flower for this patch of dirt." The way he said flower made Wren's skin crawl. It was the voice of a man who collected things. Things he found beautiful. Things he wanted to own. Stone turned back to Gideon. "I'll get to the point. I know your time is valuable." He said this with a faint irony that suggested he believed the opposite. "I want to buy the northern section of your ranch, 40 acres from the creek to the ridge. I'll pay fair price, more than fair in fact. Enough for you and your brothers to set yourselves up in Denver. Nice house, clean work. No more breaking your backs in the cold." Gideon did not hesitate. "Land's not for sale." Stone sighed the theatrical sigh of a man who had expected this answer and prepared his next move long in advance. "Gideon, your father and I had this same conversation, God rest his soul. He was stubborn about it too." He let the words hang in the frozen air. Every person present understood what he was really saying. "Your father was stubborn. Your father is dead." Silas's hand tightened on the fence post beside him. Emmett's fingers found the handle of his axe. Gideon's expression did not change by a single degree, but Wren, who had begun to understand these men better than they understood themselves, saw the muscles in his jaw go rigid as iron. "Ride on, Stone," Gideon said. "We're done talking." Stone mounted his horse with the same easy grace. He settled into the saddle, adjusted his beaver skin coat, and looked down at the brothers with an expression that might have been pity and might have been contempt. Then his eyes slid to Wren one more time. "I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into, young lady. 3 brothers, a dying ranch, a long winter. Pretty girls tend not to last long in the mountains." He turned his horse and rode away, his men falling in behind him. Virgil Crane was the last to go. He lingered for a moment, his scarred face turned toward the Dawson brothers, his right hand resting on his pistol butt. Then he smiled a thin, sharp smile that did not touch his eyes and spurred his horse after his employer. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, Silas slammed his fist against the fence post. 2 weeks after Pa refused to sell, he was dead on the trail. And that snake rides up here smiling like he's come to borrow sugar. "We don't have proof," Gideon said. "We don't need proof. The whole valley knows." The whole valley knowing and a judge agreeing are 2 different things. The county sheriff works for Stone. The county judge eats at Stone's table. We move on him without proof, we end up in a cell or in the ground. Emmett spoke, 4 words flat as hammered steel. "He'll come back." "I know," Gideon said. The next morning, Emmett found the hoof prints. He had gone out at first light to check the cattle, a routine walk he made every morning along the fence line, and there they were. Fresh tracks in the snow circling the entire perimeter of the ranch. Not a single rider wandering through. A systematic circuit. Someone had ridden slowly around the property, studying the fences, the outbuildings, the approaches, the exits. Mapping them, the shoes were distinctive. New iron sharp edged, the kind forged in a professional smithy. Not ranch shoes worn soft by fieldwork. These were town shoes, elkhorn shoes, and they told a story that did not need words. Emmett showed the tracks to Gideon, who studied them in silence. Then Gideon looked toward the northern ridge, toward Elkhorn, toward the invisible presence of Jedodiah Stone, and his face was the face of a man who understands that a war is coming and knows he cannot afford to lose it. 2 weeks later, when the trails had hardened enough for safe travel, Gideon announced they were all going to town. Silver Falls in late January was a mean little place. The cold kept most people indoors, and those who ventured out moved quickly, heads down, coat collars up, with the grim efficiency of people who understood that lingering in the open was an invitation to frostbite. The main street was rutted and frozen, the wooden sidewalks slick with ice, and the handful of buildings that constituted the town's commercial district huddled together as if seeking warmth from each other. At the general store, Wren felt the stares before she saw them. Women at the dry goods counter turning to look, their whispers sharp as scissors. 2 men by the pickle barrel exchanging glances. A woman in a gray bonnet speaking just loud enough to be heard. A young girl living with 3 unmarried men. In my day, there was a word for that sort of arrangement. Wren kept her eyes forward. She had survived worse than whispers, but the words settled into her skin like splinters, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. The rescue came from an unexpected direction. The door of the general store banged open and a woman entered with all the subtlety of a cannon shot. She was 65 years old, built like a rain barrel with a face like a friendly bulldog, and white hair pinned up in a bun that could have been used as a weapon. Harriet Crenshaw, wife of the Reverend Josiah Crenshaw, matriarch of Silver Falls, and the only person in the territory who could silence a room simply by walking into it. She went straight to Wren. She wrapped her arms around the girl and squeezed with a strength that belied her age. Then she turned to face the room, keeping one arm around Wren's shoulders, and spoke in a voice that could have carried across a cattle drive. "Wren Ashford is in this valley because Gideon Dawson invited her through a proper advertisement in a legitimate newspaper, and she traveled here under the full knowledge of my husband, Reverend Josiah Crenshaw, who will be performing the wedding ceremony in due course. If anyone in this room has a concern about the young woman's character or her situation, you are welcome to bring that concern to me directly, and I will educate you on the difference between Christian charity and small-town gossip." No one spoke. Hattie Crenshaw had that effect on people. Later, in the privacy of the church vestry, Hattie was less diplomatic. She sat across from Wren with 2 cups of tea between them, and she spoke with the directness of a woman who had lived long enough to see the consequences of being polite when honesty was required. Listen to me, child. I believe you. I believe those boys. But the world does not run on belief. It runs on appearance. A young woman unmarried living in a cabin with 3 unmarried men. You know what that looks like. I know what that looks like. Stone knows what that looks like, and he's already using it. Word is he's been telling people in Elkhorn that the Dawson brothers are keeping a girl up on the mountain. He's poisoning the well before the trial even starts. What trial? The trial that's coming. Mark my words. Stone doesn't give up. He wanted that land when Hank was alive, and he wants it more now that Hank is dead. He'll find a way to take it legally or otherwise, and if he can paint the Dawson family as disreputable in the bargain, all the better for him. Hattie leaned forward. You need to marry Gideon. Soon. Not in a month, not in the spring. Soon. And not just because of the gossip. Because when the law comes into this, and it will, a wife has standing. A wife has rights. A visitor has nothing. Wren also met Nell Pardee that afternoon. The school teacher was 26, slender and sharp-featured with auburn hair that she wore pinned in a no-nonsense knot and green eyes that missed nothing. Nell was the daughter of the town blacksmith, a girl who had taught herself to read from discarded newspapers and fought her way into a teaching position against the objections of half the town council, who believed that educating children was a job for men or nuns, and that the daughter of a blacksmith was neither. Nell and Wren recognized each other immediately the way self-made women always do. 2 people who had built themselves from nothing, who understood that the world does not hand you things, but sometimes allows you to take them if you are brave enough and stubborn enough and willing to accept the bruises. Over coffee in Nell's small schoolhouse, the teacher confirmed what Hattie had said and added more. Stone's not just talking, he's strategizing. He's been telling people in Elkhorn and Silver Falls that the Dawson homestead papers might not be valid, that Hank Dawson's original claim had irregularities. He's laying the groundwork for a legal challenge. Can he do that? With enough money and the right judge, he can do almost anything. The county judge is Judge Alden Marsh, and Judge Marsh has a very expensive taste in bourbon that his salary does not cover. Stone has been covering it for years. The ride back to the ranch that afternoon was silent. All 4 of them on horseback, single file on the narrow mountain trail, each carrying the weight of what they had learned. Wren let the horse follow the others, her mind turning over the pieces like a puzzle made of broken glass. When they stopped to water the horses at the frozen creek, Wren found herself standing alone with Gideon for the first time since the night in the stable. Silas and Emmett had taken the horses downstream out of earshot. We need to talk about something, Wren said. Gideon looked at her. His face was closed, guarded the wall up and fortified. But there was something behind it now, something that had not been there a month ago. Awareness, attention. The knowledge that the woman standing in front of him was not a stranger anymore, had not been a stranger for weeks, and that the pretense of distance was becoming harder to maintain. We need to get married, Wren said. Not because of feelings, because of facts. My reputation, your reputation, the ranch's legal standing. Hattie is right. Stone is going to come at you through the law, and a wife with legal standing is harder to push around than a mail-order bride with a suitcase. Gideon did not answer immediately. He looked at the frozen creek, at the mountains beyond it, at the sky. Wren waited. She was learning that with Gideon, silence was not absence. It was process. He did not think out loud. He thought in the deep, slow way that mountains erode, and when the answer finally came, it had been shaped by forces you could not see. I can't marry you, he said. Wren stared at him. Of all the responses she had prepared for this was not among them. You advertised for a wife. I know. You brought me 2,000 miles across the country. I know. Then explain this to me, because I am standing in the freezing cold in the middle of nowhere, and I do not understand. Gideon turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes was not coldness or reluctance or indifference. It was pain. The specific pain of a man trying to do the right thing when every option feels wrong. When I wrote that letter, I was thinking about the ranch, about what Pa said, about needing a woman's presence to hold this place together. I was thinking about you the way you think about a tool you need, a good hammer, a sharp saw. He stopped and his jaw worked. But you're not a tool, you're a person, and you deserve better than a marriage built on duty. You deserve to be loved, actually loved, not just needed. The words hit the cold air and hung there like breath. Wren felt something shift inside her chest. A realignment, the way a compass needle swings when a new magnetic force enters the field. Because Gideon Dawson, the man of stone, the man of silence, the man who had not said a kind word to her in 4 weeks, had just said the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her in her life. She did not know how to respond to that. So she said the only thing she could think of. Then what happens to me? I stay here as a housekeeper, or you put me on the next coach to Boston? Gideon had no answer. He mounted his horse and rode ahead without looking back. The conversation was over, but its echo would ring through the days that followed like a bell struck in an empty church. That evening in the cabin was the worst since Wren's arrival. The air was thick enough to cut. Wren served supper. Gideon ate in silence. Silas ate in silence, which for Silas was the equivalent of screaming. Emmett ate in silence, which for Emmett was normal, but his eyes moved back and forth between his oldest brother and the woman at the stove with the quiet alertness of a man watching a fuse burn. Silas broke first. He always broke first. So you won't marry her. You won't let her go. What's the plan, Gideon? Keep her up here until she's old, until Stone takes the ranch out from under us, until people in town decide she's a scandal and we're degenerates. Gideon set down his fork. Drop it, Silas. No, I won't drop it. This is what you always do. You make the decision for everybody, and then you tell everybody to shut up and live with it. Is that what Pa taught you? Because it's not what Pa taught me. Gideon stood so fast the chair toppled backward and hit the floor with a crack like a rifle shot. Silas stood too. The two brothers faced each other across the table. Identical faces, identical eyes, identical fury. Emmett rose between them. He did not speak. He simply placed one massive hand flat on Gideon's chest just above the heart and pushed gently. The push was not hard. It did not need to be. The message was clear. Enough. Gideon looked down at his youngest brother's hand on his chest. He looked at Emmett's face, calm and steady and immovable. He breathed. Once. Twice. Then he turned, took his coat from the hook, and walked out into the cold. The door closed behind him. Not a slam, worse than a slam, a careful, deliberate closing that said he was choosing to leave rather than choosing to fight, and that the choice was costing him everything. Silas dropped into his chair and put his face in his hands. Emmett stood by the table looking at the closed door. Then he looked at Wren, and his eyes said what they always said. Give him time. Give him room. He'll find his way back. But Wren was not sure anymore. That night, lying in her narrow bed on the second floor, she heard Gideon come back inside sometime after midnight. She heard him sit down by the fire. She heard the creak of the chair and the soft sound of pages turning. Reading his father's journal again. Talking to the dead because the living were too complicated. She pressed her face into the pillow and wondered for the first time since arriving whether she had made a terrible mistake. 23 days after Stone's visit, on a night when the temperature dropped so far below zero that the trees in the forest cracked like gunshots, someone came for the ranch. Wren was the first to hear it. Not the sound of footsteps which the snow would muffle. Not the sound of voices because the men who came were too professional for voices. It was a sound of metal on metal, soft but distinct. The sound of a lantern being opened. The sound of a match being struck. She went to the window. Fire. A blossom of orange light erupted beside the hay barn, the large structure where the brothers stored the winter feed for the cattle. Hay dry as tinder packed tight from floor to ceiling. One torch and the whole thing would go up like a Roman candle, and with it would go the only food source for 60 head of cattle. Without feed, the animals would starve before spring. Without cattle, the ranch would die. Wren screamed. The cabin exploded into motion. 3 brothers moved with the speed and coordination of men who had been raised to react to emergencies the way other men were raised to say grace. Gideon was out the door first, barefoot, a revolver in each hand. Silas was 2 steps behind with the Winchester. Emmett went through the kitchen, grabbing the hand axe and a bucket in a single motion. Outside, chaos. The hay barn was fully ablaze now, the dry feed catching with a roar that sounded like the mountain itself was breathing fire. 3 dark figures were visible in the firelight, moving away from the barn toward the tree line. They had done their work and were retreating. Gideon went after 2 of them. He ran through the snow, barefoot and half-dressed, firing into the air to drive them toward the open ground where they could not hide. Silas sprinted for the stable where the horses were screaming and kicking at their stalls in panic. He went in without hesitation into the smoke and the noise and the heat reflecting off the snow, and began leading the animals out one by one, his voice cutting through their fear with a calm that he reserved for animals and emergencies and nothing in between. Emmett attacked the fire itself. He shoveled snow onto the base of the flames, working with the mechanical fury of a man who understood that every minute the fire burned was a month of feed lost. His face was black with soot, his bandaged hand bleeding again through the wrappings, but he did not slow down and he did not stop. Wren ran to the cattle pen. The cows were pressing against the fence, wild-eyed bellowing on the edge of stampede. If they broke through, they would scatter into the mountains, and half of them would die in the cold before they could be found. She grabbed a horse blanket from the fence rail, threw it over her nightgown, and waded into the pen, moving among the cattle the way Mrs. Pemberton used to move among the frightened orphans. Slow, steady, talking the whole time in a voice that was pure calm, pure authority, pure refusal to panic. The cattle settled, not all at once, but enough. They stopped pressing against the fence. They stopped bellowing. They listened to the small woman in the horse blanket who stood among them as if she had been doing this her entire life. When the immediate crisis was contained, Wren heard a sound behind her. Boots crunching snow. She turned. A man was coming around the corner of the cattle pen, not one of the brothers. This was the third attacker, the one Gideon had not seen because Gideon was chasing the other two. The man was medium height, wearing a bandana over his face, and he was heading straight for the stable where the horses were tethered outside, loose and unguarded. He saw Wren and hesitated. A woman in a nightgown and a horse blanket standing in a cattle pen. Not a threat, not worth worrying about. He was wrong. Wren grabbed the shovel that Emmett had left leaning against the fence. The man did not see it coming. He was looking past her toward the horses, already calculating which one to cut loose when the flat of the shovel caught him across the shoulder and the side of the neck with every ounce of strength that a 22-year-old orphan from Boston could put behind it. He went down face first in the snow. He was not unconscious, but he was stunned, and by the time he got his hands underneath him, Wren was standing over him with the shovel raised for a second swing. Her hair wild, her face streaked with soot, her blue eyes blazing with a fury that had nothing to do with ranch defense and everything to do with 22 years of being pushed around by a world that thought she was too small to push back. Gideon came running around the corner of the barn, both revolvers up. He saw the man in the snow. He saw Wren standing over him, nightgown and horse blanket and shovel, looking like an avenging angel who had been interrupted in the middle of laundry day. He stopped, and on Gideon Dawson's face in the dancing firelight, Wren saw something she had never seen before. Not surprise, not admiration. Something deeper, something that went all the way down to the bedrock. The wall was broken, not cracked, not chipped, broken, and it was never going back up again. The attacker scrambled to his feet and ran. The other two had already disappeared into the tree line. Gideon let them go. He stood in the snow, revolvers at his sides, breathing hard, looking at Wren. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because she was shaking so hard, her teeth were chattering, and the adrenaline was draining out of her like water from a cracked jug, she sat down in the snow and put her head on her knees. Gideon holstered his guns. He walked to her, knelt down, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, he touched her. He put his hand on her shoulder. Just his hand. Just the weight of it, warm and heavy, through the horse blanket. "You did good," he said quietly. Dawn came gray and bitter. The hay barn was half destroyed. The fence on the east side was torn down where the attackers had entered the property. 2 cows had minor injuries from the panic. The damage was serious. Half the winter feed gone. The cattle would have to be moved to lower pastures and supplemented with whatever could be bought or borrowed, and buying feed in January in the Rockies was like buying water in a desert. But the damage could have been worse, much worse. If the fire had reached the stable, they would have lost the horses. Without horses, the ranch was dead. Emmett found the evidence. A silver button stamped with the letter S in an ornate script lying in the trampled snow near the barn. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. It caught the early light. "Stone Mining Company," he said. 3 brothers rode into Silver Falls that same morning. They did not send word ahead. They did not make an appointment. They walked into the saloon where Jedodiah Stone was having his morning coffee, and Gideon dropped the silver button on the table in front of him. Your man dropped this on my property last night, while he was burning my barn. Stone picked up the button, turned it over, smiled. Gideon, these buttons are sold at every general store in the territory. Anyone could have one. Silas stepped forward. Then explained the elkhorn-shod hoofprints around my ranch for the past month. Stone's smile thinned. Be careful with your accusations, boy. Emmett spoke. His deep voice filled the saloon the way thunder fills a valley. Our father said no. Now we say no. Next time we don't say anything. Next time we shoot. Every man in the saloon was watching now. The bartender had stopped wiping glasses. Two miners at the corner table had frozen with their cards in their hands. Stone rose from his chair. He adjusted his coat, straightened his cuffs, and looked at the three brothers with an expression that had dropped all pretense of friendliness. Three brothers on disputed land harboring an unmarried woman, threatening a tax-paying citizen in a public establishment. I wonder what the county judge would make of this. The saloon door opened. Reverend Josiah Crenshaw stepped inside thin and straight as a fence post, his white hair combed flat, his Bible under one arm. He had the face of a man who has heard every sin the human heart is capable of and has decided to love the sinners anyway, but he also had the spine of a man who knows exactly where the line is and does not tolerate anyone stepping over it. The county judge can take it up with me, Josiah said. I witnessed Hank Dawson's homestead claim 20 years ago. I buried Hank Dawson 2 years ago, and I will be performing Gideon Dawson's wedding before the month is out. Any challenge to the Dawson family's character or legal standing can be addressed to me and through me to the presiding bishop of the Colorado Episcopal Diocese, who happens to be my seminary classmate and who takes a very dim view of land fraud. Stone looked at the preacher, then at the brothers, then at the room full of witnesses. His jaw tightened. Something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, a strategic retreat. Good day, Reverend, one he said. He placed his hat on his head, stepped around Gideon without touching him, and walked out of the saloon. At the door he paused, did not turn around, spoke to the air. Accidents happen in the mountains. Your father knew that. Then he was gone. Outside in the cold, bright street, Wren was waiting by the horses. She had not gone into the saloon. This was the brothers' fight, and she understood that there are moments when men need to stand together without anyone else in the room. But when Gideon came out, she pulled him aside. Away from Silas and Emmett, away from the Reverend, away from the watching eyes of Silver Falls. You told the whole town you're getting married, she said. Did you mean it? Or was that just for Stone? Gideon looked at her. The winter sun was low and golden, cutting through the thin mountain air at an angle that made everything sharp and clear. In that light, his amber eyes were almost gold, and what she saw in them was not the guarded man she had met in December, but someone changed, someone open, someone ready. I meant it, he said, but I want to ask you properly, not because of Stone, not because of honor. He hesitated, and she saw him reach for the words, dig for, and then pull them up from a place he had kept locked for so long that the hinges were rusted. Will you? Wren, will you have me? Not because you need to, Otto, because I'm asking. It was the first time in his life that Gideon Dawson had asked for something instead of ordering it. The first time he had put a decision in someone else's hands. The cost of that vulnerability was written all over his face. Wren looked at him. This stubborn, terrified, stone-hearted, broken-hearted man who had carried his father's body 3 miles through the snow and had not allowed himself to feel anything since. I'll have you, she said, on one condition. What? You call me Wren, not Miss Ashford. Wren, my name, every day. Gideon swallowed. Wren, he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth, rough and low and careful like a man holding something fragile he is afraid of breaking, was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. That night, after the long ride back to the ranch after supper and coffee and the careful tending of burns and bruises, Emmett made his nightly circuit of the property. He checked the fences, the remaining hay stores, the stable, the cattle. He walked slowly, methodically, reading the snow the way he read wood grain, looking for anything that did not belong. He found it at the back of the cabin. The rear door, which they rarely used, had been forced. The marks were fresh, the wood splintered around the latch where a pry bar had been inserted. Someone had entered the cabin while all 4 of them were in town. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. But Emmett's eyes missed nothing. He went to the drawers in the main room where Gideon kept their father's journal. The drawer was closed. The journal was inside. But the pages were bent at different angles than he remembered, and when he opened it, he could see the faint impressions of dirty fingers on the margins. He called Gideon. The two of them stood over the open journal, turning pages, slowly counting. Gideon's face went white. One page had been torn out. He rifled through the journal, counting pages, comparing the numbers he had long ago memorized. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "The page about the silver," he said. His voice was barely audible. "The page where Pa described the vein on the northwest corner. The location. The signboards. Everything." Emmett closed his eyes. When he opened them, his face was set like stone. "Stone has it now," he said. "He has everything he needs." Gideon put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward, head bowed, breathing like a man who has been punched in the stomach. The journal lay open between them, the torn edge of the missing page jagged as a wound. Outside, a new storm was building on the northern horizon. Clouds the color of bruises were stacking up against the peaks, and the temperature was falling, and somewhere in the mining town of Elkhorn, Jedodiah Stone was reading a dead man's words by lamplight and smiling. The war for the Dawson ranch was no longer coming. It was here. Gideon punched the wall. Not in rage, though there was rage in it. In desperation. The kind that comes when a man who has held everything together by sheer force of will feels the last bolt shearing loose. His fist went through the pine planking with a crack that echoed through the cabin, and when he pulled it back, the knuckles were split and bleeding white bone visible beneath the torn skin. Silas grabbed him from behind, locking both arms around his brother's chest. "Stop, Gideon, stop!" Emmett stood 3 feet away, motionless, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes beneath his skin. He did not intervene. He understood what the rest of them were still learning, that Gideon needed to break something because the alternative was breaking himself. Wren crossed the room. She took Gideon's ruined hand in both of hers without asking permission, without flinching at the blood, and she began cleaning the wound with water from the basin. Her fingers were steady. Her face was calm. Inside, her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. This time, Gideon did not pull away. He stood there while she cleaned and wrapped his hand, his breathing ragged, his eyes fixed on the open journal on the table where a jagged edge of torn paper marked the place where his father's secret had been stolen. "Tell me about the page," Wren said quietly. So he told her. The words came slow and heavy, pulled from the same deep place where Gideon kept everything he did not want to feel. His father had found the silver vein years ago, a narrow seam running through the granite on the northwest corner of the property. Not a bonanza, not enough to make a man rich, but enough to be worth killing for, especially to a man like Stone, who already had the equipment and the labor and the appetite for more. Hank Dawson never touched it. He believed the land was for cattle and grass and the kind of slow, patient wealth that comes from working the earth, not tearing it open. He wrote about the vein in his journal as a record for his sons, a note that said, in essence, "This is here if you ever truly need it, but I hope you never do." "Now Stone has the location," Gideon said. "He has the proof that there's silver on our land. He won't come at us with torches again. He'll come with lawyers." "What do you mean?" Wren asked. "Homestead law. You file a claim, you work the land is yours. But if someone challenges the claim, if they find an error in the paperwork or argue the land isn't being used for its stated purpose, a judge can revoke the title and put it up for auction. Stone's been buying judges in this territory for a decade." Silas slammed his palm on the table. "Then we fight. We ride to Elkhorn tonight, and we end this." "He has 10 guns, Gideon said flatly. "We have 3. Math doesn't lie, Silas." "Then what?" "We sit here and wait for him to take everything Pa built." The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that means everyone in the room knows the answer is bad and no one wants to be the first to say it. Emmett spoke. He had been standing by the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, the other curled into a fist at his side. His voice was low and sure, the voice of a man who has thought carefully before opening his mouth, which was the only way Emmett ever spoke. "Don't fight him. Him. Don't run from him. Outsmart him." He looked at Wren. "She's smarter than the 3 of us put together. Ask her." Gideon and Silas both turned to look at Wren. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, Three pairs of identical amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would have made a lesser woman step backward. But Wren Ashford Dawson had never been a lesser woman. She had simply been waiting for someone to notice. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with a candle and the remains of Hank Dawson's journal, reading every page, absorbing every detail, building a picture of the family's legal position, the way Emmett built furniture, one careful joint at a time. By dawn, she had a plan. She laid it out over breakfast, speaking clearly and methodically while the brothers ate and listened. 4 steps. First, Gideon would ride to Denver and obtain a certified copy of the original homestead claim from the Territorial Land Office. The certified copy, stamped and sealed by the territory, would carry more legal weight than any challenge Stone could mount in a county court. Second, Silas would ride through the valley and gather sworn statements from neighboring ranchers confirming that Hank Dawson had continuously worked and improved the land for more than 20 years. Under homestead law, continuous improvement was the bedrock of a valid claim, and 5 neighbors willing to swear to it under oath would be hard for any judge to dismiss. Third, Emmett would watch Virgil Crane. Crane drank at the Silver Falls Saloon every Saturday night. A man who drinks talks. A man who talks eventually says something he shouldn't. Fourth, and most importantly, they would not touch the silver. They would leave it in the ground. If Stone's legal strategy was to argue that the Dawson Ranch had changed from agricultural use to mining, leaving the silver untouched, would destroy that argument before it could be made. "How do you know all this?" Gideon asked. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to recognition. As if he were seeing her for the first time or seeing a part of her that had been there all along but hidden. "The orphanage," Wren said. "Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper. She taught me to read legal documents. Land deeds, contracts, court filings. She said an orphan girl needs to understand the law better than anyone because no one will stand up for you in court if you can't stand up for yourself." Silas leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Brother, did you advertise for a wife or a lawyer?" For the first time in what felt like weeks, Gideon smiled. Small, quick, gone almost before it appeared. But real. The wedding happened 4 days later. Not because 4 days was enough time to plan a proper wedding, but because there was no time for proper. Stone's legal challenge could come any day. And when it did, Wren needed to be a Dawson in every legal sense of the word. They married on a Tuesday morning in the small white church at the end of Silver Falls Main Street. Reverend Josiah Crenshaw presided, his thin frame draped in his only good suit, his voice carrying through the cold sanctuary, with the authority of a man who has spoken the words 100 times and means them more each time. Hattie Crenshaw sat in the front pew and cried without shame or apology, the way women of her generation cried at weddings loudly and with conviction. Nell Pardee stood beside Renan as witness, her auburn hair pinned tight, her green eyes bright with emotion. She would deny later if asked. Silas stood at Gideon's right shoulder. He wore his cleanest shirt, which was not very clean, and his blue bandana, which he had actually washed for the occasion. His smile was the real one, the one Wren had only seen a handful of times, the one that lit up his whole face and made him look like the boy he must have been before grief got its hooks in him. Emmett stood behind both brothers. When Wren walked down the short aisle, he reached out and pressed something into her hand as she passed. The wooden comb. Finished now. Every petal of the columbine flower perfect, the wood sanded to silk. He leaned close and whispered the only words he would speak that day. "Welcome home." Wren wore a dress of white cotton that Nell had lent her, and Hattie had altered, taking in the waist and letting out the hem. It was plain and slightly too long, and there was a small stain on the left cuff that would not come out no matter how hard Wren scrubbed. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. Gideon wore a white shirt that strained across his massive shoulders and a pair of trousers that Wren had pressed with a heated flat iron that morning. His red bandana was tucked into his breast pocket. His hair was combed for perhaps the first time in Wren's experience. He looked uncomfortable and enormous, and as terrified as a man facing down a grizzly bear. When Josiah asked, "Do you take this woman?" Gideon said, "I do, Cho," with a certainty that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. The words came out solid and heavy, like foundation stones being laid, as if he had been rehearsing them not for 4 days, but for years, and only now understood what they meant. When they kissed, it was brief and careful and self-conscious, the way first kisses are when 20 people are watching and neither party has much practice. Silas whistled. The small congregation laughed. Outside after the ceremony, Gideon took Wren's hand. He held it for a moment, looking at her in the white winter light, and said nothing. He did not need to. His hand around hers said it. Then they went home. Because there was a war to fight, and the war would not wait for a honeymoon. The plan went into motion the next morning. Gideon left for Denver at first light. The ride was 3 days each way through the high passes, and in February, those passes were death traps of ice and avalanche and wind that could knock a horse off a cliff. Wren stood on the porch and watched him ride away, his broad back straight in the saddle, his hat pulled low, his rifle across his knees. She did not ask him to be careful. She knew it would be pointless. Gideon Dawson did not know how to be careful. He only knew how to be relentless. Silas rode out an hour later, heading south and east into the lower valley, where the neighboring ranches were scattered across the foothills. His job was to talk, and talking was what Silas did best. He would visit every ranch, sit at every kitchen table, drink every cup of coffee offered, and by the end of each visit, he would have a signed and witnessed statement confirming that Hank Dawson had worked his land continuously for 2 decades. Silas was charming and genuine and impossible to refuse, and he knew every family in the valley because he had been the one all these years who maintained the connections that Gideon was too proud to maintain, and Emmett too quiet. Emmett stayed behind with Wren. He spent his days doing what he always did, working the ranch, tending the cattle, repairing the endless small damages that winter inflicted on a mountain homestead. But on Saturday night, he rode down to Silver Falls and sat in the corner of the saloon with a single glass of water, and he watched Virgil Crane drink. The first Saturday, Crane said nothing of interest. The second Saturday, he talked about horses. The third Saturday, deep into his 4th bottle, Crane got loud. He bragged about jobs he had done for Stone, about land deals that went Stone's way because the right people were persuaded by the right arguments. And then, leaning close to a fellow drinker with a conspiratorial grin of a man who believes he is whispering but is actually shouting, he said the thing Emmett had been waiting 3 weeks to hear. $200, Crane said, his words sliding into each other. That's what the old man paid me. $200 to remember what I saw the night Hank Dawson died. Funny thing is, I wasn't even in the territory that night. I was playing cards in Pueblo. But $200 buys a lot of memory. Emmett sat in his dark corner, water untouched, face expressionless. He committed every word to memory. Then he rode home through the frozen night and told Wren everything. It was on the second day of Gideon's journey to Denver that Stone's men found him. He was high on the pass above the tree line, riding through a landscape of bare rock and wind-packed snow, when 3 horsemen appeared on the ridge above him. They did not announce themselves. They did not call out demands. They simply began descending toward him, spreading apart as they came, moving into a formation that would box him against the cliff face to his left. Gideon recognized the play. He had seen wolves do it to elk on these same mountains. Drive the prey toward a dead end, cut off the escape routes close in. But Gideon Dawson had been hunting these mountains since he was 8 years old. He knew every ridge and ravine, every stand of timber and rockfall, every place where the terrain offered advantage to a man who understood it. These men were from Elkhorn, town men paid guns, who knew saloons better than switchbacks. He spurred his horse off the trail and into a narrow defile that cut between 2 granite outcroppings. The defile was too narrow for more than one rider at a time, which meant they could not surround him. 2 of the men followed him in, and Gideon used the rocks. He dismounted, slapped his horse forward to draw them deeper into the cut, then doubled back on foot along a ledge he had climbed 100 times as a boy. He came up behind the second rider and fired his rifle past the man's head, close enough to shatter rock 3 inches from his face. The man wheeled his horse and fled. The first rider turned in the narrow space, confused. Gideon was already back in the saddle, his horse dancing on the frozen rock, and he drove toward the man at a gallop, firing into the air, using the echo of the defile to magnify the shots until it sounded like a company of soldiers was pouring fire down the canyon. That man ran too. The third man, the one who had stayed on the ridge, was waiting. He was smarter than the other 2, or more patient, and when Gideon emerged from the defile, he was met with a rifle shot that hit him in the left shoulder. The impact spun him half out of the saddle. Pain exploded through his arm and chest, white-hot blinding. He grabbed the saddle Horn, with his right hand, kept his seat through an act of will that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the knowledge that if he fell here in this place, in this cold, he would die, and his brothers and his wife would lose the ranch. He raised his own rifle one-handed and fired. The shot hit the third man's horse in the hind quarter. The animal screamed and bolted, carrying its rider away down the mountainside, and Gideon was alone on the pass with a bullet wound in his shoulder and 2 days of hard riding still ahead of him. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound the wound as best he could with one hand and his teeth. The bullet had gone through the meat of the shoulder without hitting bone. It bled freely, soaking the makeshift bandage red within minutes, but he could still move the arm, still grip, still ride. He pointed his horse toward Denver and kicked it forward. For 2 days he rode through the high country with a hole in his shoulder and the taste of blood in the back of his throat. He stopped only when the horse needed rest, and even then he did not sleep. He pressed the wound with snow to slow the bleeding. He drank from icy streams. He talked to his horse the way he talked to the old stallion in the stable, low and steady, because the sound of his own voice kept him from passing out. On the morning of the third day, he reached Denver. He went straight to the territorial land office, bloody and half-frozen, and he did not leave until the certified copy of Hank Dawson's homestead claim was in his hand. Stamped, sealed, incontestable. On the ride home, he fell in with a freight wagon train heading west. Safety in numbers. He sat on his horse with his left arm pressed against his side and the pain constant and boring and almost familiar now. Like an old companion he had come to accept, and he watched the mountains grow larger on the horizon, and he thought about Wren. He reached the ranch on a gray afternoon 4 days after he had left. Wren saw him coming from the kitchen window. She saw the way he listed in the saddle, the way his left arm hung the dark stain on his coat that was not dirt. She was out the door and running before her mind had finished processing what her eyes were seeing. She reached him as he dismounted. He nearly fell, and she caught him or tried to catch him, her small body bracing against his weight like a sapling trying to hold up an oak. He leaned on her, and they stumbled together to the porch. Inside, she cut away his coat and shirt with the kitchen scissors. The wound was ugly, inflamed, crusted with dried blood and the fibers of his makeshift bandage. But it was clean through no bone, no fragments. She washed it with water, she boiled on the stove, and she packed it with clean cloth, and she wrapped it tight, and the whole time her hands were steady, even though her eyes were blurring with tears, she would not let fall. "I got the papers," Gideon said. He was lying on the bed, gray-faced, his voice a rasp. "They're in my saddle bag." "I know," Wren said. "You stupid, stubborn, impossible man. You could have died on that pass." "Couldn't die," he said. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Promised I'd call you Wren every day. Only been 4 days. Long way to go." She almost laughed, almost cried. Instead, she pulled the blanket up to his chin and put her hand on his forehead, checking for fever, and he closed his eyes at her touch and was asleep within seconds. Silas came through the door an hour later, snow on his shoulders, triumph on his face. 5 signed statements from 5 neighboring ranchers, every one of them confirming Hank Dawson's continuous occupation and improvement of the land. Every one of them dated, witnessed, and notarized by the clerk at the Silver Falls General Store. He saw Gideon on the bed, saw the bandage, saw the blood. The color drained from his face. "Who did this?" "Stone's men," Wren said. "On the pass. 3 of them." Silas's hands curled into fists. His eyes went to the gun rack on the wall, and Wren saw murder in them, real and close and burning. "Don't," she said sharply. "We don't win this with bullets. We win it with paper. That's what your father would want." Silas stood there vibrating with fury. Then slowly his hands uncurled. He sat down at the table and put his head in his arms, and Wren saw his shoulders shake once before he went still. Emmett returned that evening with his report about Virgil Crane's drunken confession. Wren wrote everything down. 3 pieces of the puzzle gathered by 3 brothers. The certified homestead papers from Denver. The sworn neighbor statements from the valley. The knowledge that Stone's key witness was a bought liar, and Wren sitting at the kitchen table by candlelight, began to weave them together into something that could not be broken. She wrote 2 letters that night. The first went to the county court, a formal response to the legal challenge she knew was coming, laying out the Dawson family's evidence in clear and precise language. The second went to the editor of the Denver Register, and this letter she crafted with special care because Josiah Crenshaw had also written to the paper, and Wren wanted her account to complement his. She wrote about a family that had built a life from nothing on a mountain in Colorado, about a father murdered on a trail, about a mining baron who sent men to burn a widow's hay and shoot her husband on a mountain pass. She did not accuse. She did not speculate. She simply laid out the facts one after another in the plain and devastating language of truth. Both letters went out on the Monday mail coach, while Gideon-heeled Hattie Crenshaw came to the ranch. She rode up the mountain on her mule stiff with arthritis, but straight-backed in the saddle carrying a basket of food and a temperament that would have intimidated a cavalry regiment. She arrived unannounced as she did everything, and she walked into the cabin as if she owned it, which in a spiritual sense she very nearly did, because Hattie Crenshaw had been the moral authority of this valley for longer than the Dawson brothers had been alive. She checked on Gideon first, examined the wound with the practiced eye of a woman who had nursed 3 children through every illness the frontier could devise, and pronounced it healing clean. Then she sat Gideon down and told him he was a fool for riding to Denver alone, a bigger fool for not telling his wife about the ambush before he left, and the biggest fool of all for thinking he could carry everything on his own shoulders without them eventually breaking. Gideon took this lecture without complaint, which told Wren more about his respect for Hattie Crenshaw than any words could have. Then Hattie found Wren. They sat together by the fire while the brothers were outside. Hattie poured 2 cups of the tea she had brought in her basket, and she looked at Wren with eyes that were old and sharp and had seen enough of life to recognize what they were seeing now. "You're scared," Hattie said. It was not a question. Wren said nothing. "You're wondering if coming here was a mistake, if you've brought trouble to these boys instead of help, if Stone is right that you don't belong on this mountain." Wren's hands tightened around her cup. Hattie had named the fear she had not spoken aloud to anyone, the one that lived in the back of her mind, like a cold draft under a door always there, always whispering. "Listen to me," Hattie said. She leaned forward, and her voice lost its bark and found something deeper, something that came from the place where an old woman keeps her hardest-earned truths. "Hank Dawson was my husband's closest friend. I knew Hank. I knew his wife, God rest her. I know what they wanted for their boys. And it was not this." She gestured around the cabin. Not 3 men turning to stone from the inside out. Gideon locking himself in that stable every night reading a dead man's journal to a horse. Silas drinking himself blind. Emmett building a cradle for a baby that doesn't exist because he can't build himself back from the night he heard the gunshot and didn't go outside. Wren flinched. She had not known that anyone else knew about the cradle. Hattie's eyes softened. "Honey, I've known Emmett since he was born. I know what he builds and why he builds it." She reached across and took Wren's hand. "Now you listen carefully. Before you came to this mountain, those 3 boys were dying, not from hunger or cold, from loneliness, from the kind of grief that eats a family alive when there's no one to say enough, no one to crack the windows and let the air in. Gideon was turning to iron. Silas was turning to glass. Emmett was turning to wood. And then you walked in and I saw something I haven't seen in 2 years." "What?" "Life." Gideon speaks in whole sentences now. "Did you know that before you came, he hadn't strung more than 5 words together since Hank died?" Silas laughs and means it. "I can tell the difference. I've known him 30 years. And Emmett built that shelf for your books. That boy hasn't built anything for another person since his mother died." Wren's eyes were burning. She blinked hard. Hattie squeezed her hand. "You are the heart that Hank Dawson prayed for. You are the answer to the letter he wrote and tucked behind that broken picture frame. Not just for Gideon, for all of them. For this whole stubborn, broken, beautiful family." The tears came then, not the polite kind that can be blinked away. The real kind, the kind that come from a place so deep they feel like they're being pulled from the roots. Wren cried the way she had not cried since she was a child in the orphanage, alone in her cot, wondering why no one in the whole world wanted her. Hattie held her the way a mother holds a daughter, which was a thing that Wren had never experienced and did not have a word for but recognized instantly the way the body recognizes water when it has been thirsty for a very long time. When the tears were spent, Hattie pulled back and her face was iron again. "Now, enough of that. We have work to do. Stone thinks he can bully orphans and ranchers. He forgot that orphans are tougher than weeds. You pull them up, they grow back. My husband has written to the Denver Register about Stone's witness fraud. Between his letter and yours, that newspaper is going to print something that Jedodiah Stone cannot buy his way out of. 2 weeks later, the storm broke. Stone filed his challenge in county court. He claimed irregularities in the Dawson homestead papers and demanded the land be put up for public auction. He also, through sources in Elkhorn, began spreading the rumor that Gideon Dawson had killed his own father to seize control of the ranch and its hidden silver deposits. Virgil Crane was prepared to testify that he had witnessed an argument between father and son on the night before Hank's death. The rumors spread through the valley like fire through dry grass. Neighbors who had signed statements for Silas began to look uneasy. The clerk at the general store refused to extend credit to the Dawson account. A woman at the church pulled her children away when Wren walked past. Gideon bore it in silence. He bore most things in silence. But this was different. This was not a threat to his land or his livelihood. This was an accusation that he had murdered his father. The man he had loved more than anyone on earth. The man whose face he still saw every night when he closed his eyes. One evening after a trip to town where a man he had known his whole life crossed the street to avoid him, Gideon did not come inside for supper. Wren found him in the stable sitting on the hay bale, the journal closed on his knee, both hands hanging between his legs. He was not reading. He was not talking to the horse. He was just sitting there in the dark, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been hit so many times he has stopped trying to get up. Wren sat down beside him. She did not speak. She took his hand, his right hand with the scarred knuckles and the calluses thick as leather, and she held it. He gripped back hard enough for it to hurt, and his shoulders trembled once. They sat there in the dark stable hand in hand while the horses breathed around them and the cold seeped through the walls. Two people holding on to each other because everything else was trying to pull them apart. The article in the Denver Register appeared on a Wednesday 4 weeks after Wren sent her letter. The headline read, "Silver Baron uses false witness to seize Frontier Family Homestead." Josiah Crenshaw's account and Wren's letter had been combined into a devastating portrait of a wealthy mine owner using money and intimidation to destroy a murdered man's family. The story spread. Other papers picked it up. A federal judge in Denver, a man named Elijah Whitmore, read it over his morning coffee and sent a terse message to the county court demanding that the Dawson case be transferred to a federal hearing. Judge Whitmore came to Silver Falls. The hearing was held in the saloon because Silver Falls did not have a proper courthouse. Tables were pushed against the walls, chairs arranged in rows, and the whole town packed itself into the room with the intensity of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Gideon presented the certified homestead documents from Denver. Stamped, sealed, flawless. 20 years of continuous legal occupation. 5 neighbors took the stand, one after another, and swore that Hank Dawson had worked and improved his land every year for 2 decades. They told stories. The barn raising of '58, the fence line Hank helped build during the blizzard of '64, the time he rode through a thunderstorm to deliver a calf for the Hendricks family 3 valleys over. By the time the 5th neighbor finished, there was not a dry eye in the saloon and not a person in the room who doubted that Hank Dawson had earned every inch of his land. Reverend Josiah Crenshaw testified to Hank's character. Hattie testified to the family. The picture they painted was not of a contested claim on a piece of dirt. It was of a life, a family. A man who had built something real and good in a wild country and had been killed for it. Then Virgil Crane took the stand. He had cleaned himself up for the occasion, shaved hair, combed, wearing a coat that was almost respectable. He told his story the way Stone had coached him. He had been riding near the Dawson ranch on the evening before Hank's death. He heard raised voices from the cabin. He saw Gideon and his father arguing on the porch. The argument was heated, violent. The next morning, Hank was dead. Wren rose from her seat. She had not planned to speak. She was not a lawyer. She had no standing in a federal court beyond her status as the accused man's wife. But Judge Whitmore was a man who valued truth over procedure, and when Wren asked permission to pose a single question to the witness, he studied her for a long moment and then nodded. "Mr. Crane," Wren said. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying through the silent room with an authority that belied her small frame and her plain cotton dress. "You say you saw Gideon and his father arguing on the porch of the cabin on the evening before Hank Dawson died. Can you tell the court what Gideon was wearing?" Crane blinked. His eyes flicked to Stone, who sat in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face carefully blank. "A coat," Crane said. "Brown coat. Wren opened the journal. She had marked the page with a strip of cloth. She read aloud and her voice did not waver. Entry dated November 14th, 1871. Written in Hank Dawson's own hand. Gideon on the north fence line since dawn. Won't be back until dark. Riding up to town alone this afternoon. She looked up. Hank Dawson wrote these words on the morning of the day he died. His son was 7 miles away mending fence all day. 3 of the witnesses who testified today saw Gideon on the north fence line that same day. She turned back to Crane. And Mr. Crane, one more thing. Gideon Dawson has never owned a brown coat. Not one day in his life. The 3 Dawson brothers wear black leather coats made by their father. You couldn't remember what you saw because you never saw anything at all. Silas's voice rang out from the back of the room, bright and hard as a struck bell. Gideon Dawson hasn't worn a brown coat one single day of his 33 years. Pa made our coats. Black leather, all 3. Crane wasn't within 50 miles of our ranch that night. Crane's face went the color of old snow. His mouth opened and closed. In the back of the room, Stone uncrossed his arms and gripped the edge of his chair. Judge Whitmore did not deliberate long. The homestead was valid. The challenge was dismissed. Virgil Crane was charged with perjury. And Jedodiah Stone, while not charged directly, was named in the judge's written opinion as a person of interest in what the judge called a pattern of intimidation and fraud that this court finds deeply troubling. It was not a death blow. Stone was rich, and rich men in the frontier territories rarely faced true justice. But his reputation in the valley was shattered. His purchase judge was undermined, and the Dawson Ranch was confirmed as Dawson land now and forever. Outside the saloon, the sun was shining. It was late March, and there was a softness in the air that had not been there a week before. The faintest suggestion of spring so subtle you might miss it if you were not paying attention. People poured out onto the street. Neighbors who had crossed the road to avoid Gideon a week ago now shook his hand and clapped his shoulder. Silas was surrounded by well-wishers, grinning his real grin, accepting handshakes and back slaps with the easy grace of a man born for crowds. Emmett stood apart as he always did, but Nell Pardee walked over and said something that made his ears turn red, and he nodded once without looking up. Hattie Crenshaw embraced Wren so tightly the girl could barely breathe and whispered, "Weeds, child. Tougher than weeds." Then the crowd parted. Stone was leaving. People stepped steady to let him pass the way you step aside for a snake on a trail, not out of respect, but out of the instinct to keep your distance from something dangerous. He walked past Wren on his way to his horse. He stopped, leaned close, spoke so that only she could hear. "Well played, Mrs. Dawson. You're cleverer than I gave you credit for. But ask yourself this. Those 3 men lived 30 years without you. They don't need you. They just got used to you. One day you'll realize you don't belong here, and then where will you go?" He tipped his hat and rode away, his remaining men trailing behind him. The words should not have mattered. They were the parting shot of a defeated man designed to wound because wounding was all he had left. But they found their target. They drilled into the oldest, deepest fear in Wren's heart, the one that had been there since the orphanage, since the day she learned that there was no one in the world who was required to keep her. The fear that she was tolerated, not wanted, useful, not loved, that the moment her usefulness ran out, she would be alone again. That night, the family celebrated. Silas cooked elk stew. Emmett brought out a bottle of apple cider he had been saving. Gideon sat at the head of the table with his bandaged shoulder and his quiet, almost smile, and the cabin was warm and loud and alive. But Wren could not shake the cold. Stone's words circled in her head like crows around a carcass, and no amount of firelight or laughter could drive them away. She went to bed early. She did not sleep. At 4 in the morning, 2 hours before dawn, Wren rose. She dressed in silence. She folded the quilt on the bed, tucked the corners, the way she had been taught at St. Agnes, precise, invisible, as if she had never been there. She packed her bag, the Bible, the Jane Eyre, the lavender handkerchief, the wooden comb that Emmett had carved, which she held for a long moment before placing it carefully on the shelf he had built for her. She crept downstairs and wrote a note on the back of a flour sack label, the only paper she could find. "I have helped all I can. The papers are safe. Everything is settled. I don't want to be a burden. Please don't come looking. You." She set the note on the kitchen table and went out to the stable. Emmett was already awake. He was always the first one up. He had been since the night his father died, since the night he heard the gunshot and did not go outside. He slept lightly and woke at the slightest wrong sound because he had promised himself he would never again fail to act when action was needed. He saw Wren cross the yard in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying her bag. He watched her go into the stable, and he understood immediately the way he understood the grain of wood or the language of a building's bones. He understood what she was doing and why, and he knew with absolute certainty that if she rode down that mountain, the family would not survive it. He went to Gideon. He shook his brother awake with one word, Wren. Gideon read the note. The blood left his face. He did not put on boots. He did not put on a coat. He ran out of the cabin in his stockings and his nightshirt across the frozen yard, his bare feet sinking into the crusted snow with each step, and he threw open the stable door. Wren was saddling the gray mare. She had her back to him, and when she heard the door, she stopped, but she did not turn around. "Where are you going?" His voice was raw, stripped, the voice of a man who has just been woken from sleep to find his world ending. "Boston, or somewhere, I don't know." "Why?" She turned then, and her eyes were red and dry, the eyes of someone who has cried until there are no tears left and is now operating on something harder and more brittle than grief. "Because I don't belong here, Gideon. I came because of a letter. I stayed because you needed help. The help is done, the land is safe, the reputation is saved. You don't need me anymore." Gideon came toward her. Each step left a dark footprint in the frozen straw. His feet must have been in agony, but his face showed nothing except a terror that Wren had never seen on him before, not when Stone threatened him, not when the barn burned, not when he was shot on the mountain pass. This was worse than all of those. This was the fear of a man watching the only thing that matters walk away. "You think I don't need you," he said. His voice cracked on the word need, broke clean in half like a dry branch. "You think this was about the ranch, about the land, about what you could do for us. Wasn't it?" No. He was close now, 2 steps away. She could see his breath in the cold air coming fast and the way his hands were shaking at his sides. "No, Wren, it was never about what you could do. It was about what you are." He stopped, swallowed. She watched him reach down into the deepest part of himself, the place where he had buried every feeling since the night he found his father in the snow, and drag the words up by force. "Before you came, I was alive, but I wasn't living. I kept the ranch, I kept the cattle, I kept my brothers, but I didn't keep myself. I stopped that night on the trail when I picked up Pa and carried him home. Something in me stopped, and I didn't know how to start it again. And then you walked into my cabin, freezing and scared and so small, I thought the mountain would swallow you whole, and something started. I don't know what it was. I just know that the thought of getting up tomorrow and you not being here is the worst thing I can imagine. Worse than losing the ranch. Worse than Stone. Worse than anything." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. "You said Stone told you we don't need you, that we lived 30 years without you." His grip tightened. "He's right. We did live 30 years without you. And every one of those years, this place was a little more empty, a little more cold, a little more dead. You're not a burden, Wren. You're the reason this place is alive again. You're the reason I'm alive again." He stepped closer. "If you go, I'm going with you. Denver, Boston, anywhere. Because home isn't this ranch. Home isn't these mountains. Home is you." Wren looked up at him. Gideon Dawson barefoot in the snow, his face open and defenseless for the first time since she had known him, every wall down, every fortress abandoned, standing before her with nothing between them but the truth. "Mrs. Pemberton named me Wren," she said, and her voice was thick but steady. "After the little bird, the smallest one. She said it was small, but it sang the loudest, and it never flew away once it found the right tree." She placed her hand flat on his chest above his heart. She could feel it beating through the thin fabric of his nightshirt, fast and hard and desperate. "I found my tree," she said. In the stable doorway, Silas and Emmett stood watching. Silas had tears running openly down his face and was not even trying to pretend otherwise. Emmett's jaw was tight, but his eyes were bright, and on his lips was the rarest thing in the world, an Emmett Dawson smile. Gideon put his arms around Wren and held her carefully as if she were made of something precious and fragile. He kissed her forehead, slow, gentle, the kiss of a man who has almost lost everything and knows it. "Get inside, both of you," Silas called from the doorway, his voice thick and breaking. "Gideon's going to lose both feet to frostbite, and then who's going to mend the north fence?" Spring came to the mountains the way it always does in the high country. Not all at once, but in small mercies. A day above freezing, a patch of brown earth showing through the white. The sound of running water somewhere beneath the ice, faint at first, then growing until one morning the creek behind the ranch was flowing free and clear and cold, singing over the rocks as if it had never been silent. The family rebuilt what the winter and Stone's men had destroyed. A new hay barn bigger and better than the old one. Emmett designed it, and all four of them built it together. Wren hauled timber alongside the brothers, her small frame dwarfed by the logs, but her determination equal to any of theirs. New fences went up. The cattle were moved back to the upper pastures. Life on the ranch found its rhythm again, but it was a different rhythm now, a fuller one with a fourth heartbeat where there had been only three. Emmett built the addition to the cabin, a small room off the main house for himself. He moved his things out of the main sleeping area without being asked, giving Gideon and Wren the privacy that married people needed. Silas took the bunk in the new hayloft of the rebuilt barn, which he declared was the finest bedroom in Colorado. He meant it. The sound of horses breathing below him at night, he said, was better than any lullaby. On a warm afternoon in early April, Wren knelt in the dirt beside the cabin and began to dig. She had a packet of seeds that Hattie Crenshaw had given her pressed into her hand with a look that said more than the words that accompanied them. "These are from the Dawson garden, from before. I saved them when the garden died. I was keeping them for the right person. Wildflower seeds, columbine Indian paintbrush blue flax. The same flowers that Gideon's mother had carried 2,000 miles from Virginia in a cotton pouch tied to her belt. Wren planted them in the dead garden, turning the soil with a hand trowel, placing each seed carefully covering it over, patting the earth down. It was an act of faith. You cannot see a seed grow. You can only trust that it will. Silas found her there, kneeling in the dirt, with soil on her hands and her hair falling loose around her face. He stood watching for a long time, longer than Silas usually stood still for anything. The late afternoon sun was warm on the cabin wall, and somewhere in the valley a meadowlark was singing the first one of the year. "Mama would have liked you," Silas said quietly. Wren looked up. "I hope so." "She would have. She had this thing she used to say." He paused, and his eyes were not laughing and not hiding. They were just there, present, open the way they had been more and more often since the night the whiskey bottle stayed in the cupboard. "She used to say that the strongest things in the world aren't the big things, not mountains, not rivers. The strongest things are seeds, because you can bury them in the dark and they'll still find the light." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that comes from a place that has healed enough to let the light in. That same week, Emmett finished the cradle. He carried it into Gideon and Wren's room and set it down without ceremony. The wood was golden in the lamplight, every joint perfect, every surface smooth as water. On the headboard, carved in letters so precise they might have been printed, were four initials: G-U-S-E. 4 people, 1 family. Gideon performed the last act. On a quiet evening when the fire was burning low and the brothers were settled into the stillness that had once been empty and was now full, he opened the drawer beneath the mantel and took out the photograph of his father. The one he had removed 2 years ago, because looking at it was like pressing a hot iron to an open wound. He looked at it for a long time. Hank Dawson stared back at him from the photograph with those same amber eyes, the same square jaw, the same expression of stubborn endurance that all 3 of his sons had inherited. Gideon placed the photograph back in the cracked frame. He did not repair the glass. The crack was part of the story now. The way the bullet scar on his shoulder was part of his story, the way the orphanage was part of Wren's. You do not erase the damage. You build around it. You build something new that is strong enough to hold both the wound and the healing. He set the frame back on the mantel beside the portrait of his mother. 2 faces, one from each side of the grave, watching over the family they had built. On the last evening of the story, the sun went down behind the western ridge and painted the sky in shades of rose and amber and gold. Wren stood on the hill behind the ranch and looked down at what she had come to, what she had fought for. What she had nearly walked away from, two structures now, the cabin's solid and weathered smoke rising from its chimney. The new barn beside it, Emmett's design sturdy and clean-lined. The garden plot beside the cabin, dark earth turned over seeds sleeping beneath the surface, waiting. The corral where the horses stood in the golden light, their breath steaming. The pastures stretching out to the tree line where the cattle grazed on the first green grass of spring. From inside the cabin, the sound of Silas's harmonica drifted through the open window. He was playing the song his mother used to sing, the one he had not been able to play since she died. Each note floated out into the evening air like a released bird, tentative at first, then stronger, surer, until the melody filled the valley and the mountains caught it and held it and gave it back. Gideon came up the hill behind Wren. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. She knew his step the way she knew her own heartbeat. He stood beside her. They looked at the ranch together, at the life they were building from scratch in scar tissue and stubbornness and something that neither of them had a name for yet, although they both knew it was there growing in the dark like a seed pushing toward the light. "When I got on that stagecoach in Boston," Wren said softly, "I thought I was coming to find a husband." She leaned against him, her head resting on his good shoulder. "I found something better. I found home." Gideon put his arm around her. He held her close against the evening chill, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and quiet and full of something that might have been wonder. "Home found you." Below them, the cabin door opened. Emmett stepped out onto the porch, and even from the hilltop, Wren could see that his face was different, brighter. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called up to them. "There's a mail coach coming up the valley road. It's stopping at the bottom of our trail." He paused. His ears were red, which Wren had learned was the only part of Emmett Dawson that ever betrayed emotion. "There's a woman on it." Gideon raised an eyebrow. Wren looked at Emmett, then at Gideon, and she smiled. The smile of a woman who understood that this story was not ending. It was beginning. That the seeds were in the ground, and the spring was coming, and the music was playing, and the family was growing. And on this mountain, in this valley, in this old and beautiful and unforgiving country, anything was possible, anything at all.